Portland, I am so pleased to introduce you to Bill Flanagan. He is our very special guest and has so much wisdom and so much insight based on his experience being both in the sidelines and in the game when it came to Pittsburgh's many renaissances, and has so many lessons to teach us. So, Bill, welcome, and thank you so much for lending your wisdom to the city of Portland.
Well, happy to help if I can. It's wonderful to be here virtually with all of you.
Wonderful. Well, let's dive right in. Looking back over the last several decades, give us a sense of the roller coaster of Pittsburgh, and what some of the factors were in both the dips and the climbs.
Yeah, well, I'll start with what we call here in Pittsburgh Renaissance 2. And it's basically the period over the past 40 years or so from the collapse of our steel industry, which dominated the local economy for a century, to where we are today. And what happened in the late 70s and early 80s was a sudden collapse that had been building for many years, but it hit us very suddenly between 1979 and 1983, when we lost about a 250,000 jobs in the region. 300,000 people moved away over the course of the 1980s. And Pittsburgh really had to reinvent its economy, figured it had to determine a new way forward. And it really required intervention, not just economically to diversify the economy from just an industrial economy, but also on the quality of place side. The civic leaders at the time had to find a way to reinvent the town so it would be a place where people wanted to live and wanted to be. So it really proceeded on both those fronts over the course of 20 or 30 years to put us in the position where we are today.
Set the scene. I've been writing and talking a lot about the ripple effect of this. It's not just people moving away or loss of jobs, it's loss of tax revenue, which affects all the other things that our city cares about, being able to provide social services, infrastructure. That ripple effect of loss of income is pretty significant.
Well, and I was a young reporter when this story began to unfold. I came to Pittsburgh in 1982 as a reporter for KDKA TV, which was the CBS station here in Pittsburgh. And I got thrust into covering all of those stories. Yes, it was an economic story. Yes, it was an organized labor story. Yes, it was an industrial story and a business story. But it was also about, the impact on communities. I covered sheriff sales and foreclosures. I did stories on alcoholism. I did stories on domestic abuse, all the social consequences of what happened here. And then, as you mentioned, it became a story about loss of tax base for municipalities, as not only did the mills close that really supported many of the communities all over the region, but even housing values began to decline. And so it created a crisis, an economic crisis throughout all of Western Pennsylvania, but most profoundly in what we call the Mon Valley, the steelmaking valley of Pittsburgh. And frankly, we've made a lot of progress over the past 30 or 40 years, but we're still not all the way back. Those communities are still not all the way back to where they were before.
So it sounds like one of the factors in creating a renaissance, I'm a big fan of Renaissance, was partnership, collab, and tell me more about the structure of the Alleghany Conference, how it came together. It sounds like a great solution.
Yeah, well, it brings us to this idea of Renaissance in Pittsburgh. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we call the period, I think that we've kind of just wrapped here in Pittsburgh, we call it Renaissance 2. And that was the response to the loss of our industrial base, the steel economy, and the diversification of our economy and the improvements in quality of place to make sure we can attract and retain talent. But we borrowed the playbook from something that the Alleghany Conference did 80 years ago, which is when the organization was formed. And the conference, although we're called Alleghany Conference, and it sounds like Alleghany County, which is our core county, it's really not a governmental organization. It's a private sector 501c3, initially led by the business community. Although today the organization's board is made up of businesses, universities, foundations, but all private sector. And it was built from the beginning to be a partner for government. So the Alleghany Conference brought a private sector sensibility to those original challenges for Pittsburgh back in the 1940s in the post-war era. Back in those days, I mean, Pittsburgh was hell on earth. In fact, it had been nicknamed hell with the lid taken off because of all the smoke and
Oh my
soot that poured out of the factories in the valleys around here. And during World War II, this was a place where employment was 110%. Every able-bodied man and woman in this region was in a mill during the war because all the young men were overseas, right? They were in Asia and Germany fighting the war. And so as the war started to near an end, the civic leaders here, and initially it was Carnegie Tech, the predecessor of Carnegie Mellon University, and Richard King Mellon, the big banker in town. They got together and decided that if they didn't do something to clean up Pittsburgh, it would have no future because nobody would want to live here in the post-war era. So they brought together the big CEOs of the big companies here in Pittsburgh. And back in those days, Pittsburgh was home to many of the biggest companies in the United States. And they brought them together to form a committee for post-war planning. And they basically developed a strategy as a private sector-led organization to get the smoke out of the air, clean up the skies, get the industrial pollution and the sewage out of the rivers, and then engage in urban redevelopment, really trying to take care of blighted, rundown, old industrial slums across the region, and really invest in them and improve them and make it a higher quality of place. That became known over time as the Pittsburgh Renaissance. Today we call it Renaissance One. But it was fundamentally led by the private sector, getting together to say, we can't compete. Our businesses are not going to be sustainable here unless Pittsburgh's sustainable, unless the broad region is sustainable in some way. And so that really drove the creation of the Alleghany Conference. And the organization has continued to play that role ever since as a convener, bringing together the private sector more broadly, and then most important, being there as a ready and able partner for government, whether it was initially the mayor of the city of Pittsburgh, David Lawrence, who partnered with R.K. Mellon to engineer Renaissance One, or more recently, it would be the Allegheny County executive, the governor of Pennsylvania. But the whole model is built on the private sector working very closely with government leaders to take on the big challenges and unlock the opportunities for the region. And we've been doing it now for 80 years.
Portland has its culture, it has its personality, and some of that is conflict avoidance. I think a lot of Portlanders and even institutions have a hard time confronting problems head on. Sometimes because we can be a very idealistic community, there can be maybe a lack of understanding about the complexity of some of our issues and all the things that an issue might touch. But then once that is understood, there can be a very slow movement forward, which I know there can be great reasons for moving slowly. But when we are in a crisis, it's time to act. And, I guess the question here is, what was the leadership style that was needed? What was the personality needed to rise to the occasion of a renaissance?
Yeah, well, really two different renaissances, right? Because the initial one was very much top down. It was the big business, the big banker in town, and then ultimately the mayor of Pittsburgh, which dominated the political scene 75, 80 years ago, and then the president of the university, and the fellow CEOs that really drove the change that led to the original Pittsburgh Renaissance. By the time the steel industry collapsed, though, other sectors had really risen into prominence, driving the economy, driving the change, providing thought leadership. In particular, our universities. Pittsburgh's blessed to have two Tier 1 research universities in Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh. And not only are they kind of co-located a few miles east of downtown in Oakland, but they collaborate very actively. They have a spirit of collaboration. CMU is more digital, Pitt is more life sciences, but they have become not just an engine for educating, but a real engine for economic development in the region. And we're also blessed because of our industrial legacy to have very powerful and very large foundations, a dozen private philanthropies in Pittsburgh created through the wealth of people like H.J. Heinz and the Mellon family. And in fact, I think the statistic is Pittsburgh has the second or third highest concentration of foundation assets per capita in the United States. The only metro that beats us is Seattle, and that's thanks to Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. But what it does for us is it gives us patient social venture capital. And the foundations are here to invest for the long run. And as we try things and experiment, whether it's rebuilding our economy or diversifying it, or whether it's improving the quality of place, we have those foundation assets as an investor. So over time, it's led to a new dynamic for leadership. Business and government still at the table, as they have been, since the 1940s, but over the past 30 or 40 years, joined at the table by the universities collectively, by the foundations, and even the broader nonprofit sector. And then increasingly in more recent years, it's been also a lot more at the community level, trying to find a way to give community organizations a voice. The community development corporations, community development organizations, and to make sure they're being heard and that they can offer their 2 cents and contribute to moving the region forward. So the leadership dynamic has become a lot more complex over the past 30 or 40 years than it was in the early days of Renaissance One.
Yeah, I feel like I need to point out an elephant in the room, which is that you've mentioned a lot of names of people who are really helpful and pivotal in the entire last, quarter, maybe I guess half century in these renaissances. But everyone you've mentioned has been a man. I'm assuming a white. I'm assuming a lot of wealth too. In this day and age, it's really important that we have people from all backgrounds at the table, because then we don't lose sight of things like harmful gentrification. Is that a value now in Pittsburgh as well?
Oh, absolutely. There's a slide I love to show when I do presentations that shows the original meeting of the Alleghany Conference, the leaders, back in the 1950s. And they have their wonderful model of what they were going to do at the point and build this park. And they're all sitting around this big table together, and they're all wealthy white men. And that was the top-down leadership of the time. And over time, it's become much more diversified. There's no question. Some of the things I've been talking about, the improvements in quality of place through the 80s and the 90s, Teresa Heinz, who was the widow of Senator John Heinz and the heir to the Heinz fortune, she became one of the major drivers of Pittsburgh's approach to sustainability, green building, making sure when we built a new convention center 25 years ago that it was the largest green building in the world. So Mrs. Heinz had enormous impact here. Another woman named Carol Brown really led the charge on the creation of the cultural district, which was the vision of Jack Heinz, who was the grandson of H.J. Heinz. But it was really Carol Brown who put together the plan and organized the community and ultimately delivered what became the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust and the Cultural District. So over time, there's been much, much more engagement of more diverse leaders, not just gender, but racially, ethnically, and lots of different backgrounds in participating. If you looked at the board of the Alleghany Conference today compared to that picture, from the 1950s, you would see a diversity of color, a diversity of gender, a diversity of background that really reflects the way you have to include people today to achieve these kinds of goals. We do have to push ourselves as a community to make sure people are included, because there's a natural default, right? You invite people to come to a meeting who look like you, who share similar backgrounds and experiences. And because of our demographics in the region, I think we have to be mindful and intentional to make sure that lots of voices have an opportunity to put in their 2 cents. Yeah, I've gone back and looked at those pictures of those incredibly well-meaning white men, back in the 50s. But I've often asked myself, well, you know what? How different would Pittsburgh's future have been if there'd been just a few women in the room, right? Or just a few African Americans, and what additional perspective would they have brought? Could we have avoided some of the mistakes that were made in terms of the urban redevelopment of the 60s if there'd just been a little more diversity? And personally, I think it absolutely would have been the case, and the outcomes would have been very different. But hopefully we've learned that lesson, and we're more inclusive and intentional about it today, certainly than they were back then.
Well, Bill, this has been fascinating. I could talk to you for hours, but will you leave us with maybe your best advice or piece of wisdom or wish for Portland as we develop our own renaissance?
Well, my wish for you is incredible success. As we mentioned when we talked about doing this, it's been decades since I've been to Portland, and I thought it was such a beautiful, dynamic place when I was there in the '90s. Remembering what Pittsburgh was like in those days, there was such doubt here, so much lack of confidence, and so I've watched Portland from afar all these years as you all emerged as this with a brand and an identity and this excitement and enthusiasm about what's been happening in Portland. I think the most important, as you're embarking on this latest effort to sort of redefine and revitalize and re-envision your community, um, I, always remembering that it does take time. There's no magic switch or button you can press and suddenly transform a community. You have to be willing to stick with it for the long haul. And I think what Pittsburgh has been good at doing over the past 80 years is bringing leaders together, coming up with a shared vision of the future, then sticking with it, that vision as you begin to implement it. And then along the way, continuing to include newer, younger voices, emerging leaders in the community so that they can carry the momentum forward. I think one of the risks is you can come up with this wonderful plan of your today's leaders, but if you don't have a strategy to bring tomorrow's leaders to the table and make sure that they have some ownership and they can continue to move it forward, then you could lose. You could lose the momentum. And we've been really good at putting together a plan and sticking with it for a long time. But I guess I'd leave you with one final thought, which is actually an observation of David McCullough, the Pulitzer Prize winning historian, who has written many books about many great biographies about American leaders over the course of American history. And he was a native son of Pittsburgh. And so Mr. McCullough came to Pittsburgh in around 2001 to dedicate our new convention center. And in his speech, he said, you know what? If you climb up to the top of Mount Washington, which is this hill that overlooks the Golden Triangle in downtown Pittsburgh, if you go up to the top of that mountain and you look out there, everything you see, I don't care if it's the clean rivers, the clear sky, the tall buildings, the park, the fountain, everything you see, none of that just happened. People made it happen. And he said, that's the most important lesson you can take from Pittsburgh. It doesn't just happen. People make it happen. People who say to themselves, we can do better than this. We're going to come up with a plan. We're going to invest in it. And most important, we're going to stick with it until the job is done. So I wish you luck in Portland that you can do that yourselves.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. Thank you so much, Bill. People make it happen. We're going to take that wisdom and we're going to move forward. Thank you.
I wish you well. Thanks so much.